So we're on the second part of stripping the gearbox on this Enfield Bullet. Today we'll see how much we get done. We might get it all done. We're back where we started with regard to stripping, so we've removed the external ratchet mechanism and the outer cover, and we'll carry on. The next compartment contains oil, so we need to drain that. I'm going to remove the drain bolt, which is up under here. There's 3 bolts that are to do with the oil. So there's a drain plug there. This one here is the level plug, and this is the filler plug. So let's get that drain plug out, which is a, what size? I think it's a 15mm, which again, most of the fittings in here are Whitworth sizes, so we'll there's usually a metric that's close enough to fit. I always get confused which way I'm undoing these. There we go. So I'll take the drain plug out. So this has got, my one has gear oil in it, which is nasty and smelly. A lot of standard Indian bullets will have fluid grease in them, which is it's a controversial subject, which I won't get into, as to what you should put in the gearbox. If it's grease, it's quite thick, it's semi-solid, so if it's cold, it won't really run out. Ideally, you would have the gearbox warm before you take the drain screw out, because it's really gloopy stuff, and once you get in there, it's all over everything. I would highly recommend gloves, because even the gearbox oil is quite nasty, smelly stuff. The grease is particularly unpleasant to deal with. I'm going to let that drain while I start stripping parts off the outer cover. So we've got the shifter fork, which pulls off. I may not be naming these things absolutely correctly, but you'll get the idea. So these posts that support the ratchet back plate unscrew. So they each have a washer under them, that's those posts, and you can see the flats on it that we use to tighten those in. So we'll put them off to one side. There we go, both off, and now the back plate should pull off. That's the whole back plate assembly. As you can see, there's a captive spring in here on the front side. You can see those slotted holes that we were using for adjustment previously, and there's another spring on the back. I'll just leave those all in one place. I can't remember if there's a collar in here. No, there doesn't seem to be. Right, so that bit's done. Next thing I'm going to remove is the main shaft bearing cover, which is this aluminium casting here. It also holds the kickstart return spring captive underneath the lower one of these screws. So again, it's a Whitworth. I should get an 11mm on it. Just. So remember, there is a spring under tension on the end of this screw. I think they're a slot head normally. They're normally an actual screw rather than a hex head, as I remember. Mine was damaged and I've replaced this with a hex. Right, that's going to go. Mind your fingernails. There we go. Right, so that's let the tension off that screw, off that spring, and that's your Whitworth screw. So we'll take the other one out. That's the second one out, and this cover will lift off. Yeah, it is an O-ring, so this cover has an O-ring inside it because oil can technically leak past the main shaft bearing. It probably won't because I've put a sealed one in here, but it's possible, so that's what keeps the oil in normally. We have the clutch push rod, which we can withdraw. These vary a lot between models. They can be one piece, they can be two piece. There's often a ball bearing. If they're a two piece one, there's often a ball bearing between the two pieces, which you want to at least know the whereabouts of. So I'm going to, from the clutch side, use the half of the push rod to push the ball bearing out. I should be able to. So there's my ball bearing, and there's the other piece of the clutch push rod. So it goes right through the centre of the main shaft. So you can see I have my two pieces there. This is the end which pushes on the clutch pressure plate, and then there's the two pieces which have a ball bearing between them. Right, so we need to, well, we may as well remove the kickstart spring, so it just unhooks from, this is actually the lay, end of the lay shaft sticking through, and this unhooks from it. Now the end of, this is the end of the main shaft. As I say, it has a nut on, and it has a lock washer, tab washer there. So we'll need to knock down the ends of the tab washer, for which I will require a small hammer of some description. I'll just stop you while I find one. Okay, so I've just used the end of a screwdriver to push the tab of that lock washer away from the flats on the nut. Now I have already dismounted the clutch from the other end of the main shaft. I've covered that in another video, so I've taken the primary cover off, dismantled the clutch pack and undone the central nut on the clutch. So I now need to undo this nut, which is a reverse thread. So this one unscrews clockwise, which is the opposite direction to the one on the other end. You would need some sort of tool to hold that still on the other end if you're going to do it with conventional tools. As it happens, I have an air impact wrench, so this should spin it off. But we need to put it to tighten, not loosen. And this is a 21mm socket. And yes, I know it's not an impact socket. There we go. So that's the easy way to do this. I would strongly suggest, if you don't have an impact wrench, borrow one for this job. Both the end of the central clutch nut and this nut, it makes it so much easier to remove them. So it is actually quite an unusual nut, so careful not to lose it. It's quite a small form factor. Okay, so we need to pry that lock washer out, and as I remember, there's an oil flinger sort of, well, I'm not sure if it's an oil flinger or a seal, I can't remember what they call it, but there's this collar which is keyed, so the lock washer keys into it there, and then we bend the tabs up to stop that unscrewing. Okay, and my oil's pretty much stopped draining now, which was useful. So we're nearly at the point where we'll be able to take this outer cover off. I'll just pull the clutch cable out. Oh, it should pull out. Maybe it's going to be a bit recalcitrant. I'll just tap it through. It's just the far ends kind of stuck in there. Oh yeah, that's coming. Right, we've got that out of the way. Now, let's talk about this hex bolt here. Don't undo this. This holds a striker plate on the inside that retracts the kickstart pull when it's in the fully closed position. It is an absolute swine to get that set in the correct position. So if you don't have a problem with the kickstart pull returning, don't touch that. Leave it where it is and put it back in the same place. I'll show you the mechanism once we have this cover off, but do not undo that bolt unless you need to. We're going to undo this next. This is a sprung pull mechanism that indexes the internal gear shift. So it's bigger than it looks. This hex nut is a lock nut, and pay some attention to the position of it. Now I can just see the first thread sticking out past the nut, but what I'm going to do is undo it and just see how many threads I've got showing, because this is one of the adjustments. You can set the tension with which it clicks into each gear using this. It's also a piece that's relatively easily damaged, so they sometimes need replacing. They're not particularly expensive, so if it does look in any way iffy, then replacing it's probably a good option. So what I'm going to do, there's a washer there as well, isn't there? Yes. It's not going to want to come off easily. Come on. There's my washer. So actually, on my one, we have 4 threads sitting deeper than the... it's just to give me deeper than the casting. It gives me an idea of how far in or out that needs to be. What I'm going to need is a finer screwdriver. I think I have one just over here. Okay. So you'll notice the slot in this is parallel to the ground. That, on most of them, corresponds to the orientation of the pawl inside. Again, you'll see what I mean shortly. So I'm going to unscrew this, and you'll feel it feels a bit odd as you're doing it, because there is a sprung part there. Right, so that's unscrewed, and when I pull this out, you'll see there's a pawl there, and this is quite heavily sprung. So this is what engages with the internal selector into notches in it, which when it's in gear just holds that in the correct position. So get an idea of how far out that's sticking. I have seen these where they're kind of stuck in, and obviously that's not going to work as well as it should do. In theory it's possible to dismantle this, clean it, make it all work better. In reality they're very cheap to buy, and I would just get a new one. Right, so we are ready to remove the outer cover. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 screws. So I'll crack these loose. That one's being reluctant. Got it. Okay, let's remove these. I'll just stop you while I remove these screws. Right, so that's me loosened the screws, so we'll just take those out. Can't remember if there's longs and shorts. Those two top ones look short. Yeah, these bottom ones are slightly longer, and that middle one is also a short. So that's those removed. So we should now be able to remove the cover. Yes, now there's a gasket in there. Hopefully we'll be able to reuse that, but if not we can fast make another one. So you heard that clunk? That was the internal gear selector falling down out of its little pocket that it sits in. So I've pulled this off. It looks like we've torn the gasket. Well, it's come away cleanly anyway. So this is the kickstart mechanism, and here's the end of the lay shaft that the kickstart mechanism fits into. So if I turn this round, you'll see this is the kickstart pawl, and there's that striker plate that I was talking about. So when you turn this, that's what engages with the ratchet on the lay shaft to turn the engine over, and when it reaches the top, that striker plate pops the pawl back out of the way so it's not constantly ratcheting. Now this will push out, but I'm not going to just now because I don't need to. You'll notice there's a bronze bush inside this. On a lot of the standard Indian bullets, that bush is made of cast iron, and you can have a problem where it starts to pick up and catch on the end of the lay shaft. And what that will show itself as is when you put some real power on the bike, the kickstart will start to rotate itself down without you having touched it, and that's the end of this shaft catching on this bushing. You can buy aftermarket bushings to fit in the end of there. I will say it can be a real task to get the old cast iron bushing out. I've done it twice and had to do it destructively both times, and it took a while. The bronze one goes in easily enough, but it may need to be reamed to suit the diameter of the lay shaft. I managed to just ream it out with effectively an emery paper flap wheel, and that worked quite well. But yeah, just be aware that's a thing. And this is the gear selector, so that square shaft that the neutral finder sits on is the gear selector. Again, this would just push out, but I'm not going to because I don't need to. And that's our main shaft bearing. So that's the outer portion removed, and now we're into the gearbox, which seems like a good point for a break. Okay, so the We're now into the inside of the gearbox, so the actual gears themselves. If you've got an Indian bullet which is grease filled, this is pretty nasty. This will be really thick with claggy semi-fluid grease. It's worth taking the time to get a rag and take as much of it out of the way. It will get over absolutely everything. So you've been warned. What we want to do is pull the main shaft. You can get, I should have showed you actually, looking in there. So this is the lay shaft, this is the main shaft, and this is the gear selector, the internal gear selector, which engages with the selector forks, which we'll see later. And that, the end there, is what hooks into this pocket. So when you're reassembling, you need to make sure you get the end of that in this pocket as you push everything home. Otherwise you won't have any gear selection. Wonder if I can zoom you in a bit on that just so you get a better look. And that's the gear selector. We'll go into this a bit more in a bit more detail. Okay, so it is possible to remove all the gear clusters without having to dismount the gear selector arm, which is a little bit fiddly. I may or may not need to do that. I'll show you it anyway once we've stripped this down a bit more. So yeah, we want to take the main shaft out. And my one's still slightly engaged in the clutch hub, so I'll just pop round and push that through. So that's our clutch main shaft. It's freed off properly from the clutch now, so the main shaft will pull out. That's the main shaft out. As you can see, there are some gears which are pressed onto it, and there's an oil flinger there as well. So there's a gear and an oil flinger and some selector dogs that are part of that. So it's worth looking at all the parts. Make sure the edges of these dogs are in good condition, that they're not chipped out or worn particularly, because that can be a cause of poor gear selection. So we'll put that to one side, and we should be able to lift the rest of the gearbox out. So here's the, it takes a bit of wiggling. So that's all come out now. So there's our lay shaft, and those are our gears, and this is your selector fork. So those gears will lift off the selector fork, and the smaller gear goes towards the outside of the bike. The dogs on the reverse of this seem to take a hammering, so mine are a little bit chipped. It's been having difficulties engaging gears, and it's left a gear in there on the main shaft sleeve right up against the other side bearing. So take that out. There's a selector fork, so the pins go towards the bottom, and that's the lay shaft with its gears in place. So these gears are pressed on the outside and inside. These are two of the ones that you sometimes need to replace if you're putting in either trials gearing or close ratio gears. I think this one's replaced for the close ratio gears, which this bike has. And that's our gearbox pretty much apart. As I say, there is one more gear in the back on the main shaft sleeve. If we wanted to take that one out, we would need to remove the whole primary chain case and undo the final drive sprocket to get this one out. And our selector arm is in there and freely mobile. So I'm going to stop now and I'm going to have an inspect of this main shaft, see if this is what my problem is. I'll try and go over some more of the internals of the gearbox, how they work. It's a bit tricky because it's dark. A head torch will hopefully help. This is the gear selector, which rotates on a pin. And it's just pressed steel. This portion here has a series of notches in it. So it's like a quadrant with a series of notches in it, and that pole that we took out earlier goes through this hole. So as, this is tricky to show you without getting in your way, so as that rotates, the pole engages in these notches and holds it in a certain position, and each of those notches equates to a gear position. And there's two forks that essentially swing backwards and forwards inside the gearbox, moving the gears along the lay shaft. So that selector fork we had previously engages in those two forks, and as the as the selector moves backwards and forwards, it shunts the gears backwards and forwards along the main shaft and lay shaft. That's how that works. You should be able to see right at the back, there's a big bronze bush there, which the lay shaft rides in. That can wear, and sometimes needs to be replaced. You have to take the gearbox out to do that, I would think, because it would need heat and a press to put the new one back in. But the other end of the lay shaft fits in there. And this is the main shaft sleeve here that the gears slide along, and that's that first gear. The dogs on this are quite prone to chipping, so if it's jumping out of first gear, sometimes it's because these dogs are damaged. They are looking a little bit chipped on this, but jumping out of gear has not been a problem thus far, so I'm going to leave that where it is. As I say, to get that out, you would need to remove the final drive sprocket, so I'm just leaving that where it is for the moment. And these two gears slide along that shaft. If we can get it to engage with the splines. So they slide along this shaft, and again that selector fork I say it's all a bit tight. Might be easier to just have it on there. Right, so that's in, and we should be able to engage that in those forks. So that's our gear selection, effectively. And when this outer sleeve rotates, it turns the back wheel. Then we've got our lay shaft here, and these two gears are held together as well, and they slide along the lay shaft, and again the other end of that selector fork engages on those. So that's how the gears are moved. This gear and this gear on the lay shaft are pressed on to a taper, so if we need to get them off, they need to be pulled off somehow, and you would need to get at least one of those off to get these gears off the lay shaft. I'm not concerned about these. This is a new lay shaft, so it should be straight. Just a word on the on this selector. If you want to get this out, there's this pin here. This pin that it pivots on has a cap, and that cap is in the back of the gearbox. Now you can get at it, but it's very tricky to get at. I'll zoom you out a little. No, it's not going to. I'll show you that cap. Okay, this is quite tricky to show you, but if we go up round the back of the gearbox, and you can see the gearbox mounting nut there, and below it is a, I see this is extremely difficult to show you, just below there is a sort of screw, but it's not a normal screw. It has it's effectively a cap over that pivot pin, and you need to take that out and draw the pivot pin out of the back of the gearbox. So as you can see, you would probably need to take the back wheel out and the mudguard out in order to get at that. When I've done it previously, I have managed to unscrew it. Ah, there you can see it. I have managed to unscrew it with a, see if I can shine some more light in there as well. There. So you can see the slot, and then the bit in the middle is the end of that pivot pin. So you need to unscrew that. When I've done it before, I've managed to sort of abuse a screwdriver as a chisel, and then undo it. I suppose you could fabricate a tool using a piece of flat bar with a notch in the middle to unscrew that. I'm not going to take that out just now because I don't think I need to. I'm not concerned that that's gone wrong. Okay, so I'm going to try and get this gear off the main shaft. This is really not the way to do it. I'm risking chipping the gear because it's case hardened steel, but the ideal way would be with an arbor press. But you work with what you got. I'm going to heat up the gear, and then I'm just going to try and drive the main shaft out. That's going to be pretty hot now. I've got aluminium drift, and I've put the nut back on the top to help protect the threads. So we'll see if this will come. Seems to be moving. I'm going to add some more heat. Okay, we'll try that again. That's smoking hot now. It is moving, that's the oil flinger off. Right, that's being problematic. I'm going to get rid of the oil flinger and have more of a look at it. Right, we'll keep trying. It is moving. There we go, that's loose. That's got the sprocket loose. Oh, hot, 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 hot. Now we've just got the dogs to get off, if that keeps moving the way it has been. So that's my main shaft off. Oh, hot. And that's my gear shift dog, the gear itself and the flinger. So now we need to reassemble. So I've got the new main shaft in the freezer. Okay, so as the saying goes, reassembly is the reverse of the above. I shall try and get this on. I should mention I've got a block of wood underneath this to protect the threads. That appears to be touching the edge of the taper now. Sprocket back on. It is going. Nearly there. Okay, that looks like it's on. And we'll get the oil flinger. Which I think just actually sits over the top. Yeah, it does. Okay, no gaps there. And we'll just seat that. I think that's good. So that should be ready to reinstall. See, it's pushed down onto the tapers there. slingers in. Yeah, that's looking good.